for folks just joining, I think we had a default on that videos were off, but you should be able to turn them on now if you're willing and able to do that. So just the controls in Zoom are changing all the time. I'm having to relearn. Thanks for being here on a Monday morning. We appreciate it. Okay, I think we're at a pretty good quorum, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Morning, everybody, and thanks for being here and for joining this session of the Colorado Clean Truck Strategy Stakeholder Working Group. We're looking forward to this conversation and want to personally say apologies for all the emails from me in the past month. I know we've had some rescheduling that we've had to do, so thanks for bearing with us on that. In terms of our agenda for today, I'll just be starting us out with a quick welcome and overview, and then we'll pass it to Will Tour, who will talk through the draft regulatory actions piece of the Clean Truck Strategy. Then we'll open it up for questions and discussion, and then we'll close out with some updates to our timeline and next steps. We may not need the full hour and a half today, so we'll let you go early if we're able to, but did want to leave time for conversation if it was needed. So to start out, just some notes on participation. As I mentioned before, for folks who joined early, if you could update your participant name and include your organization, just so we can be reminded of who everyone is. I know a few folks have had to have alternates from their organizations for different meetings, so it's just helpful for us to know who everyone is. And for time's sake, if folks could introduce themselves in the chat today instead of doing a go around, that would be great. If you could include your name, organization, and maybe a quick highlight from your weekend, since it is a Monday morning, that would be great. Just a reminder that this meeting is open to the public to observe, and that public participants not in the working group will be automatically muted. And we are recording this meeting so that folks can take a look at it later on. So yeah, please go ahead and put your intros in the chat, and I will just talk through some reminder guidelines for participation as we have our discussion today. Just a reminder to help create space for new voices to be heard. If you tend to make comments a lot, maybe take a quick step back and let other voices step up. Keep comments brief and to the point. Treat everyone with respect, of course, and avoid harsh language or personal attacks. Obviously we have different perspectives in this group, and we're here to try to solve some hard problems together and figure out a good path forward. So I think that is it from me. I will go ahead and pass it over to Will to go over the next pieces of the Clean Truck Strategy following our earlier sessions where we reviewed some of our early plans for some of the other portions. And Will, do you want me to keep presenting slides here?
That would be great. So next slide, please. Great. Well, thanks. Yeah, so for anyone who I don't know, Will Tour, the director of the Energy Office. And just as a reminder, we've been talking through many different elements of a clean truck strategy, including procurement, incentives and financing for vehicles, infrastructure investment, utility programs, workforce, and other issues. And, and at today's meeting, we'll be talking about the potential regulatory elements and presenting essentially the recommendations from the staff team for discussion. I'll spend probably about 20 minutes sort of talking through this, and then we can, throw it open to questions and discussion. And also as a reminder, looking at potential regulatory elements was one of the things that we committed to in the state greenhouse gas reduction roadmap that was released in January of 2021. Next slide, please. So there are sort of three major buckets that we are recommending move forward. The first is that CDPHE propose adoption of both the Advanced Clean Truck Standard and the low NOx omnibus rule to the AQCC. And the intent here would be to both ensure GHG and air pollution emissions reductions and the associated benefits, both for the community as a whole and particularly for disproportionately impacted communities. We are proposing that a notice of proposed rulemaking be filed sometime during 2022, likely with rulemaking hearing in 2023, with the intent that if the AQCC then adopted the rules, they would go into effect for model year 27, and that there would be substantial work done in advance of the notice of rulemaking, in particular working with the enterprises, the Clean Fleet Enterprise and a community access enterprise to build 10-year plans informed by input from stakeholders from communities, as well as manufacturers and motor carriers, to ensure that we have the investments and complementary policies that in place to support a successful ability to move forward and implement, especially on the advanced clean truck. We also think a key piece here would be to make sure that there's significant opportunities for community engagement, especially in disproportionately impacted communities, before the notice of rulemaking. We are also proposing that by the end of this year, CDOT establish a working group to work with statewide stakeholders in public transit about potential future adoption of a clean transit rule that would require a long-term transition to zero-emission transit buses. And that by the end of 2023, the state agencies investigate options for ensuring adoption by state, county, municipality, and other public fleets, as well as large private fleets, in alignment with the Advanced Clean Truck Rule. This approach could involve fleet rules, MOUs with fleets, and other approaches. Next slide, please. As a reminder, Advanced Clean Trucks is a standard that was adopted in the state of California, but under the Clean Air Act, other states have the ability either to stick with federal standards or to adopt the standards that were developed in California. And they're required to be, meet an identicality requirement, although there's some ability to look at implementation in ways that address unique needs of individual states. Requires manufacturers of medium and heavy duty on-road vehicles to sell a certain percentage of their vehicles that they sell each year have to be zero emission vehicles. There's sort of a crediting process for tracking that. It provides some flexibilities and abilities for things like credit trading. Also includes one-time fleet reporting requirements. And it's in many ways analogous to the zero emission vehicle standard for passenger vehicles that the state adopted in 2019. And the requirements grow each year. To give a sense of scale, if this were adopted and went into effect in 2027, you would be looking at requirements for class 2B and 3 of a little over 2,500 vehicle sales, and for class 4 through 8 vocational trucks around, I think that's around 750 vehicles in there, and then again growing over time. Next slide, please. The low NOx omnibus rule is really focused on enhancing the emissions requirements for the non-ZEV vehicles that will make up the majority of vehicles for many years to come. It would reduce NOx emissions per new vehicle sold by 75% below current standards in 2024 and 90% in 2027. If we adopted it, it would be going to effect in 2027. And there's clearly, significant public health benefits associated with reducing NOx emissions and significant benefits for meeting ozone standards. It would require manufacturers to comply with these emission standards, overhaul engine testing procedures, and further extend engine warranties. Next slide, please. So, the reason that we're proposing this is we think it's very important in ensuring that we can meet our climate goals and reduce air pollution, especially in disproportionately impacted communities. We think that there's significant ability through the enterprises that were created by Senate Bill 260, as well as the utility investments created by Senate Bill 19077 to implement and fund complementary strategies to support the transition, particularly investments in infrastructure and incentives for fleets. We see over the long term cost savings for fleets from this transition, and that there's strong signals from major fleets and the industry that they're moving in this direction. Next slide, please. As a reminder on the sort of where this fits in a greenhouse gas roadmap, we have a target of 50% reduction economy-wide by 2030, and a 40% reduction from transportation, which is just under 13 million ton annual reduction in GHG emissions by 2030. As of now, the low and zero emission vehicle rules that have been adopted for passenger vehicles are projected to achieve about 6 million tons, about 2 million ton reduction from the various policies that we're on that have set us on a trajectory to about 1 million light duty electric vehicles by 2030, and about 1.5 million ton reduction from the GHG transportation planning standard that the Transportation Commission adopted in October. So leaves a gap of about an additional 3 million tons that we will be targeting through a variety of approaches that include things that are moving to support land use decisions that would lead to more housing near jobs and reduce VMT and pollution, looking at the potential of post model year 2025 standards for light duty vehicles. Their AQCC will be evaluating potential indirect source rules for reducing emissions from certain type of land use, significant investments moving forward in public transit. But the clean trucking strategy is also a key piece of that. And the regulatory tools are one important element. Next slide, please. From a environmental justice perspective, we know that disproportionately impacted communities are more likely to be in close proximity to major freight routes, that in the metro area, That includes, I-70, 270, and I-25, where there's significant exposure to both NOx and PM emissions in those neighborhoods, so that in addition to sort of the broad regional impact that we have, for instance, through the NOx emissions on regional ozone formation, there are also sort of very localized impacts that are significant for environmental justice communities. It's also the fact that we know that these vehicles have very long lifetimes, and so that it's important to move forward as quickly as we can to start supporting a trajectory of cleaner vehicles. Next slide, please. In the analysis that MJ Bradley did, the trucking analysis for the state, they looked at several different scenarios. One was scenario of adopting the Advanced Clean Truck Standard. Another was a scenario of adopting Advanced Clean Truck and low NOx. And then a third was an aspirational scenario of getting to essentially 100% ZEV market share by 2040. Next slide, please. When we look at GHG emissions, what we see is that both ACT and ACT plus low NOx are very similar on the GHG side, with about a 6% reduction by 2030 and 45% reduction by 2050, somewhat deeper emissions reductions associated with the 100 by 40 aspirational scenario. Next slide, please. For NOx, what we see is that there's a really important role for the low NOx standard, that by 2050, ACT got us to about 50% reduction in NOx emissions, whereas ACT and low NOx together were projected to achieve about a 90% reduction in NOx emissions, and similar levels from the 100 by 40 aspirational target. Next slide, please. Again, we see significant reductions in particulate matter, with ACT plus low NOx together getting to a more than 50% reduction in particulates, which again have significant impact, especially in those immediately surrounding neighborhoods. Next slide, please. When we looked at it from financially, using social costs of greenhouse gas, NOx, and particulate reductions, what we see are very significant social benefits, on the order of many billions of dollars of benefits by 2050, with much of that coming from the social cost of greenhouse gas reductions, but also significant value from especially the social cost of the NOx emissions reductions. This is using the social cost of greenhouse gases as specified in Colorado statute that we're required to use for both AQCC rulemakings, and that was included in Senate Bill 260 for looking at transportation, and then using EPA's valuation from the EPA COBRA model for PM and NOx. Next slide, please. We also used the information from the study on vehicle costs, and a couple of things here that I think are important to acknowledge. The first is that the study did suggest that in the near term there are incremental costs to going to ZEV vehicles. Those are expected to decline over time as we get essentially driven largely by the cost reductions for batteries. Over the last decade, we've seen an over 80% cost reduction and anticipate additional cost reductions into the future. There are fuel and maintenance cost savings that are experienced today, But it is undeniable that as of now, there is a higher upfront cost to buy a zero emission truck than there is to buy a diesel truck. And while the projection suggests that post 2030, that will no longer be the case, or will be, much smaller incremental costs, we know that over the next decade, there's a challenge there that needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. We, in the analysis that was done looking at financial costs, so this is not including the, those benefits that come from social cost of carbon or social cost of other emissions reductions. Basically what we see is that if we move forward on the ACT plus NOx scenario, that we're looking at some net cost during the 2020s, some net cost reductions during the 2030s, and then significant cost reductions during the 2040s, so that we really see the next decade as sort of a key arena that we need to focus on how we can bring state resources to bear to support both the infrastructure and incentives for vehicle adoption. Next slide, please. Again, when we start layering in all of the societal benefits, we see net benefits, over the entire time period of the rule, and including, the benefits to utility customers and the monetized benefits, again, of the reduced emissions, both of GHG and of local and regional air pollutants. Next slide, please. So, when we look at the potential sources of funding available to support this transition, there are a number that we think are important. Again, the largest are the enterprises created by Senate Bill 260, projected to be about $700 million of fee revenue over the next decade, $323 million for the community access enterprise, basically 290 for the clean fleet enterprise, and about 130 million for the clean transit enterprise. Would also note for community access enterprise, where we would be getting funding for both EV charging and hydrogen fueling infrastructure, that in addition to that fee revenue, there's projected about another $115 million into the Colorado Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Fund through the underlying existing $20 per vehicle growing with inflation fee on electric vehicles that goes into the infrastructure fund. Utility TEPs, and I think we're all familiar that their first TEP by Excel had $105 million over 3 years, but the legislation requires every 3 years a new TEP to be filed, so there will be 2 more complete TEP cycles during this decade. And we think there's real opportunities to bring investment to bear to support medium heavy duty vehicle charging infrastructure. There are $57 million in formula funds from the Federal Infrastructure Act that for charging, with a focus on corridor charging, as well as the ability to compete in the $2.5 billion discretionary grants for charging. And we don't really know what's going to happen in terms of the climate provisions of Build Back Better, but potentially significant additional funding, both for infrastructure and potentially tax credits for the vehicles. And then the governor's budget proposal includes $150 million for school bus electrification and $15 million for cleaner trucks. Next slide, please. We've done just sort of a very high level analysis, and clearly this is one of the arenas that significant additional work would need to be done between now and any notice of rulemaking. But looking at the ZEV sales that would be required under advanced clean trucks and looking at it sort of in the simplest way, where you simply assume that there was no credit trading among different categories of vehicles and that manufacturers were complying separately in class 2B3, class 4 through 8 straight trucks, and then the class 7 to 8 tractors. Looked at the number of vehicles that would be required between now and 2030. And obviously we can't pre-commit what the enterprises are going to do. That will be a decision of the enterprise boards. But it does suggest that there's actually sufficient funding available, particularly since electric school buses would also be helping to meet some of these targets, that there's sufficient funding available to provide significant incentives for at least over 50% of the ZEV sales expected under the Act. So lots of work to be done there, but we think that there is a real opportunity to sort of build incentive programs that support adoption in a way that could match well with the potential regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. We've also just been looking at the commitments that fleets have been making, and that in some cases are, more aggressive than the ACT requirements. And I won't run through all of these, but looking at companies like FedEx, Schneider Electric, Edison Electric Institute members, Walmart, Unilever, Amazon, IKEA, we're seeing some pretty aggressive targets for fleet adoption that we think will fit sort of very well with helping to achieve, the level of adoption that we would be looking at through ACT, or in some cases substantially higher levels in particular categories. Next slide, please. And again, where we are seeing some really significant public commitments being made by the leading OEMs in the MHD market. Stellantis has a commitment of, by 2030, 70% low emission vehicle sales in Europe, 40% in the US. Ford is targeting 100% fossil free by 2040. Daimler, 100% carbon neutral in driving operation in North America, Europe, and Japan by 2039. We've got commitments that we're seeing from Toyota, from Volvo, from PACCAR, that all seem to align, quite well. And again, in some cases being more aggressive than what we're looking at in terms of potential regulatory adoption. Next slide, please. So our proposal and the proposed timeline would be that, we move ahead with finalizing the clean truck strategy with a draft release this month, finalizing this spring, and moving into implementing early priorities, proposing to initiate the rulemaking on advanced clean trucks and the low NOx omnibus rule by the end of the year. We've seen that the time we've had over the last couple of months to work on the strategy, and I know we took a few more weeks than we were originally planning on, has enabled the agencies to think more about what we can really move forward on and prioritize in terms of near-term actions. We think that this proposed timeline would enable us to get investments and programs in place to support adoption prior to adoption of ACT rule, and means that we would be able to not only say we know that there's funding available through various pots like the enterprises, but have specific 10-year investment plans that I think would be very important to informing deliberation on a rule. We think this timeline enables a robust stakeholder process, gives time to seek participation by DI communities, fleets, and industry stakeholders. And we also think that this timeline makes sense given some of the supply chain issues that we have been seeing. We know that the trucking industry is, extremely focused right now on meeting those supply chain needs. And macroeconomic trends suggest that those are going to ease later during the year. And so we think of this as an appropriate timeline to allow the industry to really be able to focus and engage in that rulemaking stakeholder process. And I think that, Kelly, I can't remember if there's another slide in this. I think this sort of concludes what I was going to speak to.
Yeah, I think, Lauren, if you're on the call, I don't know if you wanted to speak a little bit to some of the stakeholder engagement planning that you've been working on.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Thanks, Kelly. I'm happy to do that. In part to meet the requirements of the Environmental Justice Act, House Bill 1266, and also just as a part of the state's commitment to environmental justice and to creating more inclusive stakeholder engagement and representative policy processes, we are doing an increasingly deeper stakeholder process with each rule that we put forward as part of this effort. And so a lot of the advanced clean trucking rule making process would include that type of strategy. And so you'll see more earlier stakeholder engagement, you'll see more town hall meetings and listening sessions provided both in English and Spanish, making sure that we have really accessible plain language outreach materials so that they're clear to average Coloradans and community members, so that they can understand the issues and have informed opinions and come and be a part of the policy process, and making sure that those materials are provided at least in English and Spanish as well. And just really focusing on the health impacts and economic impacts, both in how we think about this rule and how we communicate about it. And then I find holding smaller community conversations to be particularly helpful in just hearing, priorities and values and concerns from community members. And so making sure we're focusing on some of the most impacted areas and areas to maybe reap the greatest benefits in terms of air quality improvements. And so making sure we're having those conversations. And then increasingly, we've been having workshops with organizations who work in environmental justice and who serve disproportionately impacted communities. And so I would invite anyone here, I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat in just a minute, but if you're one of those organizations and we're not already talking, please ping me so that I can make sure you're a part of those conversations, because there may be things we're not thinking of that we absolutely want to make sure on our collective radars. And so we want to hear from you. And then of course, presentations to various stakeholder organizations and groups, just to make sure we're getting the word out there and everyone has a chance to weigh in and be a part of the process. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren.
Sure.
Will, I don't know if you want to talk through this. This is just kind of going back over some of the key actions we think we might be able to move forward this year in the clean truck strategy.
Yeah, happy to. Again, I think this gives context for the regulatory discussion and sort of it's a good reminder of just how much is in the clean truck strategy. So, it includes the analytical work, moving forward on electric school buses, both, with existing funding and supporting electric school bus adoption, given the new federal funding that will be available. But hopefully the legislature will act on the governor's budget request, and we will also have a significant, large new state-funded program to support electric school bus adoption. Again, hopefully the legislature will act favorably on the budget request for the clean truck replacement program that's really focused on helping to get some of the dirtiest trucks off the road and getting going in the near future. We'll be working on both the public and stakeholder input, and then the analytical work and ultimately adoption by each one of the boards of the Clean Fleet, Community Access, and Clean Transit Enterprise 10-year plans and their programming implementation during the first year. And by statute, the 10-year plans need to be adopted by June, and then funds will start flowing. Realistically, it'll probably be around August, and so a little bit after that, in the fall, that we'll have initial program implementation really beginning to move forward. A lot of work to do on charging study and planning, the hydrogen roadmap implementation, and multiple opportunities on hydrogen, but with a specific focus on hydrogen, fueling investments. It's already time to really begin engagement with utilities on the next TEPs to support medium and heavy duty infrastructure investments. Again, there's some of that in the initial TEP, but we think things will be ripe for a significantly larger focus on the MHD side, to the analytical work to understand the workforce needs, the work on exploring indirect source standards, and that is Regional Air Quality Council has been engaged on, but the state agencies are also increasingly engaged in exploring, establishing the working group on the Clean Transit Rule, and the stakeholder work then leading to a notice of proposed rulemaking on ACT and low NOx. So those are the core elements of the clean truck strategy that we see significant work happening on during 2022. And with that, I think it's really time for questions and discussion.
I see a hand raised from Tom. Tom, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Bill, for the presentation, and thanks for letting me join the meeting in place of Jacob Smith. And very interested to see your revised timeline, given that the AQCC had scheduled rulemaking as early as, I think, May or August of this year. So I assume that has changed now, which I actually think is a good thing, in that I was kind of wondering about kind of setting all those things in motion that you were talking about. And I think it's a great idea to get all those things in motion beforehand, because it'll help the rulemaking conversation go a lot better and kind of avoid e-trip attacks and things like that. So I think it's good. One thing I am curious about is will this stakeholder group kind of keep on meeting throughout that process, or will it be sometime merged with what AQCC is doing, or what are your plans there?
Yep. So I'll take the first part of that, and it certainly is true that there was a placeholder on the Air Commission long-term calendar for, I believe, an April notice of proposed rulemaking. And given all of the work that needs to be done, sort of as you said, we think there's substantial work that needs to be done in advance, and that we will all be better off to be able to have investment plans in place and complementary programs, not just be able to sort of wave our arms about them, but actually have sort of real program plans to inform that rulemaking process and debate. When it comes to the future of this stakeholder group, I guess I would defer to some of the other folks on the state agency team, sort of how how we're thinking about this group going forward after the clean truck strategy itself gets finalized.
This is Lauren. I think at least from my vantage point, that remains to be seen, but I do think we'll be having conversations with this group in one format or another. And I don't know if there's maybe more opportunity to continue providing input on the strategic plan itself, or if that, what that timeline looks like, but definitely want to continue engaging with these individuals in one way or another. So just stay tuned.
Yeah, I think it's a good question and one that we need to figure out, and also that we probably love some input on, because as you're seeing, we'll put out a draft strategy. We're going to take input on that and want to really hear from you all on how that looks, but then are going to be wanting to move into implementation of some of these early priorities. And so I think a question we've had is, what's the best way to keep engaging folks like yourselves in implementation? So anyway, to be determined, but we would definitely like to keep working with you all to the extent that you're interested. I see a couple of other hands up. Patricio, looks like you're next.
Yeah, and apologies for not being on video. I'm recovering from COVID, so just getting better. Hearing this presentation, this is pretty alarming that you all are choosing to punt this another year when you had a very clear timeline and ability to get these rules adopted this year, and it's very surprising. I understand a desire to get some other programs in place before you do it, but that's really, that's built into adoption of these rules. You have a 2-year lead time to get those things done. Not to mention the fact that these rules, they start out low, right? It's not a major 100% shift that we're talking about in the first couple of years. So getting them on the books, getting these foundational policies on the books, it's what helps create the momentum to get those additional kind of smaller policies, incentive dollars, infrastructure spending that you want to see done. This is what creates that momentum to do it. It's also the direction that the industry and the fleets are already moving in. Will, for all the reasons that you laid out on why these rules aren't that aggressive, frankly, to begin with, the fact that we have all these commitments from major manufacturers on their transition plans, on fleets, on the demand for these vehicles, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to be delaying it even further, particularly as you have 5 states last year that have adopted the rules and another handful that are planning to do so this year. So I'm really struggling to understand what the real kind of delay here is and rationale. Supply chain issues, we can certainly talk about those. That's something that's plaguing not just, it's plaguing manufacturing across the board. It's not unique to zero emission vehicles. And the rules have built-in ability to accommodate for challenges in the macro economy. So there are adjustments and flexibilities that are already inherently built into them to address those kind of challenges. And again, in 2 years, if we're still dealing with supply chain issues when the rules would begin, we have much bigger problems to worry about. So I would love, a deeper explanation on why, this delay, why such a significant delay is being considered so early on in 2022 as well.
Thanks, Patricio. Well, I guess first I would characterize it a little bit differently in that this is the first time that the state is actually formally proposing to adopt or to do a formal rulemaking on ACT and the low NOx rule. What was committed to in the greenhouse gas roadmap was to evaluate potential adoption. And so far from there having been some decision to adopt that is then being delayed, they were actually recommending that there be a formal rulemaking process to consider adoption. And certainly the Air Quality Control Commission had a placeholder on their long-term calendar in April. Right? We think that it will be a more successful rulemaking and a better informed rulemaking process if we are able to move forward on developing these other elements, especially the 10-year plans of the enterprises, in order to be able to sort of say with some specificity what type of infrastructure investments are going to be available, what type of vehicle incentives are going to be available, in order to address what seemed like very real issues in the 2020s. The analysis, I think, supported the notion that we need to make significant infrastructure investments, and that there will likely need to be fleet incentives for at least some types of fleets during the early years of this program. And we frankly don't see a huge impact one way or the other in terms of vehicle numbers, based upon whether it's adopted late in 2022 or whether it's adopted in 2023. As you've pointed out, the initial numbers are relatively modest and they grow over time. So the difference between whether it is formally in effect in 2026 or not, we don't think has a really significant material impact to the achieving our GHG goals. And we would certainly have the ability to consider tools like early action credits to provide additional incentives in those early years, as well as we would certainly be starting the investments from the enterprises in those early years, so that we would be able to both get the infrastructure in place and be supporting those early actions by fleets that wanted to adopt. So and on the supply chain side, certainly agree that the issue is not sort of supply chain challenges in 2026 or 2027. It's more trying to respect the fact that industry stakeholders who need to be a part of the stakeholding and engagement on the rule have a lot of other challenges that they're facing right now. And we want to make sure that the Colorado trucking industry in particular really has a fair opportunity to fully participate during that stakeholder process and during the rulemaking process, and at giving some time for the current supply chain challenges to abate would give them a more realistic opportunity to really fully participate.
Travis, I think you're next.
All right. Hi, I'm Travis Smitson, Transportation Program Director at SWEEP. I'd like to just echo what Patricio said. I'm concerned that not completing the rulemaking this year gives up a full model year where this rule could be in place. And I'm just thinking that we haven't talked that much about the urgency of the climate crisis and the urgency of addressing the public health problems of air pollution, especially in neighborhoods near busy highways. And, I hear everything you're saying, Will. I just think that if we could get this rule done before the end of 2023, we could then move on to other business. There's a lot more that we're going to need to do beyond the advanced clean truck rule. You mentioned the indirect source rule. That's going to be a complex rulemaking that I think is going to take a lot of time at the AQCC. And if we're bumping advanced clean trucks into 2023, I'm concerned that we're going to be bumping all the other things that we need to do to hit the greenhouse gas targets that are listed in the state's roadmap. And I guess the question is, do you see a way that you could move the rulemaking into 2022 so that, maybe late 2022, like when we adopted the low emission vehicle rule? I believe that hearing was in November and it was in the register by the end of December. That would be my preferred course. Is that schedule possible? Thank you.
Thanks. But I think we could certainly have conversation about schedules, and interested in hearing input from everyone on that. Again, I think it would be challenging given the what I think is the imperative of moving forward on the 10-year plans and, getting to a point where we know what the early year implementation is going to look like, but we're certainly open to conversation.
Thanks, Zach. Ask your question.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Will. Just echoing Patricio's and Travis's concerns about the delay in the timeframe. I think it was just in November in the meeting that was had, the public meeting that was had, that we had a May 2022 timeframe up on the timeline that was shared, and so certainly concerned that it's going to go out another year. I think with since November we had 4 or 5 additional states join the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, and one of the things that I'm curious whether it has been looked at by Colorado is sort of what moving this back a year not only does in terms of the delay with 2026 to 2027, but also the near-term delay. I think from there, as you said, there's limited supply of electric trucks being built right now, and that limited supply, if you're a manufacturer, you want to be putting that in states that have passed the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, because those states, there's numerous benefits to the manufacturers in order to meet their goals that are coming with the early action credits. If they are exceeding their goals, they would like to do so in the state where they get a credit that they can sell. So I think Colorado is, by delaying it, will not only delay the time when states start to implement or OEMs start to implement it, but in the near term, there's going to be very little incentive for manufacturers to focus on Colorado operators. So that's one thing. I would be curious if you had your folks who were doing the consultants that were doing the report, whether they looked at what the difference between the move for adoption from a year does in terms of near-term deployments in Colorado. And then I think to folks who are kind of or manufacturers who do have customers coming online, if they don't know that they're going to be getting early action credits, there's an incentive there to delay that until they have some clarity on that. So do hope that there's an openness to going back to the 2022 timeframe. I think a lot of states have shown that can be done. The regulatory process can be done within the timeframe, the next 10 months. And it is really important, if we're going to get more electric trucks on the road sooner in Colorado, having that clarity from a regulatory perspective is key. Thank you.
See, who else do we have in the queue here? Chris, up next.
All right. Well, thank you, Kelly, and thanks, Will, for that presentation and all the work that went into that. I did want to echo what you had heard earlier, and I really wanted to key on what Travis had said. If there's a possibility to leave an option open for 2022 adoption, as Zach had said, I think some of us just maybe assumed we would see adoption in 2022. And Will, you're correct that in the early years, maybe it doesn't make an absolute change in some of the GHG numbers. And I think Travis also brought up that in the early years, it's not very stringent. That's true too. But one additional factor I think you should consider is the ramp rate. And if you jump in late, you're missing some of that ramp rate. If you jump in early, you get all that learning that comes with a lower ramp rate. And then I'd also reiterate what Zach was speaking to, and the fact that especially manufacturers who have obligations in other states are going to place their ZEV trucks accordingly. It's strictly a business decision, and that might not mean as much to greenhouse gas benefits, but I certainly think on EJ communities, the clean air benefits are measurable. And with that, that's the only question I had, and I'll just add on to what Travis has said again. If there's any way at all we could look at 2022 adoption as a possibility, or early actions that mirror some of the other states, just to make sure Colorado gets their share of EV trucks. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Chris, for that comment. And as Will said, I think we're going to be considering all of these as we try to weigh all the different things we're trying to move forward this year. Tim, I'll pass it to you next.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks, Will, for the presentation. And this is Tim Bluebaugh with the Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association. And we appreciate the thoughtful comments about the need to establish the infrastructure, to get the funding in place for the infrastructure, to establish the incentives while ZEVs or ZEV trucks are more expensive than traditional vehicles, and get that in place. We believe that those elements must be in place before deploying vehicles, and especially the infrastructure. It's the most expensive, most complicated, longest lead time element of this marketplace. And we can't ignore that in thinking about how to deploy ZEVs. And if we do this wrong, we think there could be some significant unintended consequences. You mentioned, Will, that heavy duty, medium and heavy duty trucks last a long time. Currently, less than 50% of the trucks in Colorado are of the 2010 or newer technology, the latest EPA emissions control technologies. Less than 50% are within the latest emissions control program that went in place 12 years ago. Those are old trucks. And if we do this wrong, fleets will be motivated to keep those old trucks longer. They can invest more in maintaining them, and they can indeed keep them on the road longer. A 20-year-old truck emits 10 times the pollutants, particulate matter and NOx, as current trucks. A 30-year-old truck emits 60 times the PM and NOx. We don't want those trucks to stay on the road longer. We don't want to motivate fleets to maintain their existing products longer. We don't want to motivate them to purchase trucks out of state either. So we appreciate those comments. We think that looking at this both as vehicle availability, infrastructure, and incentives, all three combined must be in place before deploying vehicles is the right way. And I would ask one question. It came up, I think it came up in the presentation, but we would ask for a scorecard, if you will, of the number of ZEVs anticipated by the ACT rule and the availability of suitable infrastructure for those ZEVs. Since infrastructure is a very expensive, long lead time element, can we see, and maybe it was alluded to in your 50% number, I'm not quite sure, but can we see a sort of scorecard saying, over the coming years, with the adoption of this rule, here are the number of ZEVs we expect to be deployed, and check the infrastructure, which is a complex thing to do because different charging stations are needed for different vehicles and different locations and things, but to check where that infrastructure is ahead of time. I've heard that it takes 2 to 4 years to get a charging station in place. If this rule is to go into effect in 2027, the effort to put the charging infrastructure in for those 2027 vehicles should be underway very soon. So we would like to see a scorecard that evaluates the development of that infrastructure so we have some comfort that it will be there when the vehicles need to be deployed. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. I think that's a great suggestion. And one of the early strategies that we've identified in the Clean Truck strategy is putting a finer point on how many charging stations of what variety we think would be needed to support some of the goals and targets that we've included in the draft strategy. And so I think that would lead into us being able to then track progress towards that. But we think there's a little bit more needed to understand that mix of depot versus public charging and exactly what's going to be needed to support the transition. But I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah, indeed, Kelly. Very complex. I don't mean to dismiss how complex that would be, and we would be happy to take part and contribute however we can to that effort. But we think it needs to be done. So glad to hear you guys are working on it.
Great, thank you. Ian, you're up next.
Yeah, hi, Ian Thomas Savoy, State Director for Green Latinos. I want to start by just acknowledging some of the things that other people said that definitely make me nervous, especially as a representative for disproportionately impacted communities. If this were to delay other rulemakings or make the overall agenda drag out longer, that's clearly not what voters, people, EJ communities, everyone who's come together to work on all these plans over the years has been asking for. In fact, we've asked for accelerated timelines whenever possible. To the industry folks who are worried about these vehicles not coming to Colorado, I think that's a very real concern, because we won't be realizing it if we don't get the trucks here. I do want to just extend an opportunity for those industry folks to come together with an EJ coalition that we're working on. I don't think that we have had a chance to sit down and hear each other's points of view on this. I think it's very important and critical work as we represent people in the just transition on both sides of it. And so I just want to use this as an opportunity to extend that. And lastly, I guess, really just say that I stand firm with everyone else in a request to continue working on this year, to not delay. I think that we have done a lot of work to get financing moving, and I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think it's critically important for the communities that we represent. I think all the feedback, and I'm reading here in the chat, others that I work with that agree with that. And so I just want to express that.
Thanks so much, Ian, for being here and for those comments. Got a few more hands in the chat. If folks haven't spoken and would like to, please feel free to raise your hand. But Patricio, you're up again next.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that I've been hearing. I think the first around infrastructure, I find the idea that the state should be responsible for that kind of a bizarre notion. What we're seeing, and I think actually Tesla, frankly, can speak to this, and how infrastructure is a value add for many of these companies. We're seeing in just the past couple of weeks a major announcement from Daimler, BlackRock, and NextEra Energy. $500 million in infrastructure spending. So this isn't, purely a responsibility that should be falling on the state to be planning out and doing this. This is a manufacturer, challenge that needs to be solved. And while there's certainly support that should be coming, having a certainty with that advanced clean truck roll schedule, where there is a guaranteed deployment that we know of, having that certainty earlier can better justify these types of investments that we want to see happen. The other thing I want to point out is, we've been focusing a lot on the advanced clean truck roll, but obviously, and frankly, in the near term, more important is that heavy duty omnibus rule. And delaying that an additional year is delaying the 75% emission reduction benefits that is going to come from that rule for an entire year. And that's a lot of new trucks that could be 75% cleaner being put on Colorado's roads, by pushing it off for an additional year. So that's really, I would love to see, I think someone else mentioned this, a comparison for what it would actually cost the state from a public health perspective from pushing off adoption from 2022 to 2023.
Thanks. Just one comment I'd like to make or clarification. So the state does not assume that there is 100% public responsibility for infrastructure. We have sort of consistently over the last several years sort of looked at the need for state and federal investment, utility investment, and private investment. And in the lead up to Senate Bill 260 last year, there was a high-level analysis done by International Council for Clean Transportation of the projected level of infrastructure investment needed during the next decade to meet both our light-duty vehicle goal and our medium and heavy-duty vehicle goals. Concluded there was a need for about $1.2 billion of infrastructure investment across sectors over that time period. And again, through the enterprise and the Colorado EV Infrastructure Fund, we're looking at something like $400 million of state funding, 50 or sort of 60 to 100 million of federal funding, some amount of utility funding, and significant private sector funding that will be needed. So just wanted to clarify that there's never been an assumption it's 100% a state responsibility.
Great, thanks, Will. Zach.
Thanks, Kelly. And yeah, I actually also wanted to talk about infrastructure because I do think there's two ways to look at this. One is sort of, the state seems to want to give more time for the infrastructure to come. But I think what you should be looking at with the advanced clean truck wheels, this is a way to kickstart infrastructure investment from operators and manufacturers across the state. We're seeing with all of our initial deployments and throughout the industry that these initial deployments are going to manufacture or operators who are operating depot charging and sort of the hub and spoke routes for their vehicles. So they'll be going out all day for a shift, come back and charge. That infrastructure is going to be built by the operator. There may be incentives, they'll be working with the utility, but that they will do so once they place that order. And I think getting that to happen on the suitor side will start kicking off that process. And then they'll start to realize if they want to extend how far they want to serve with these trucks, they'll determine where there needs to be more public infrastructure. And that'll be something they could work hand in hand with the state and with the utilities. But you can look at the transit sector where they've used this depot model and have been electrifying, moving much faster in terms of electrifying buses in Colorado and in states across the country where there is this experience in terms of building depot charging to support large fleets of electric buses. And that the same thing can happen, with large fleets of electric trucks in the near term. So we do think that near term, most of the deployments will be this sort of hub and spoke model. We're looking forward to moving out when there's going to be a greater need for public fast charging for trucks, and that's going to be coming. But I think getting that initial depot charging installed on the sooner side, which comes from an earlier adoption of the advanced clean trucks, is really going to be essential. And the industry is working collaboratively on a megawatt plus fast charger for electric trucks that would allow electric trucks to do virtually any duty cycle that a diesel truck can do. But it's really important to get those initial deployments out and get the depot charging up and running, because that is going to be the base for virtually all larger operators in terms of how they're going to electrify their fleets. So just wanted to touch on infrastructure in that. I think it's actually an argument to expedite rather than slow down the ACT effort. Thanks.
Thanks for that comment, Zach. Tom.
Thanks. And I kind of started off the discussion perhaps a little bit too enthusiastically about delaying things, and probably noticed I didn't specify a date in there, but after listening to other folks during the call, we would definitely support moving by the end of 2022.
Thanks for that comment, Tom. Anyone else who hasn't spoken yet in the working group have a question or comment? Otherwise, we can close out in the next few minutes to give folks back some time, but appreciate all these questions and comments. Yeah, I'll give it a few more seconds. Appreciate all the thoughtful comments folks have made. Jenny.
Hey, thanks. I just wanted to echo what a lot of folks have said about the need to do it this year. But especially Ian's point about, I appreciate the intent behind, we want to do more outreach to disproportionately impacted communities, and that's why we're delaying it. But, you've already been hearing from disproportionately impacted communities, and they're advocating for doing it as soon as possible. So I would hope that you would take that into account.
Thanks for that comment, Jenny. Appreciate it. Okay, thanks for all the comments, folks. And of course, we're here by email, etc. If there's further follow-up questions or comments that you want to make. But to respect everyone's time, we will move to the last portion of our agenda just to kind of go over where we're at with our timeline. Moving forward, we're probably have some emails going out after this to reschedule some things that we've had to move around. But I will share my screen and pass it over to Kay if you'd like to walk us through these last few slides.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. And I would agree. Thank you, everyone, for your input and your comments today. Just to kind of remind folks of where we've been and where we're headed. So, this is where we've been to date, really working hard on the analysis, the medium and heavy duty study, doing public engagement meetings along the way. We did just start drafting the clean truck strategy in the November-December timeframe. And then moving to the next slide, in terms of where we're going from here, we are currently in February 2022 already. We are going to be releasing a draft strategy for comment in February. The enterprises are also going to be beginning their 10-year plan engagement over the course of the next several months. We plan to do a public input meeting on the clean truck strategy, possibly even multiple public input meetings on that starting in March after folks have had a chance to look at the draft and digest it. So keep an eye on our website for those dates and times to be announced. We're hoping that that strategy will be finalized sometime in the spring. As with other documents that we've put out, it will depend on the number and the types of input that we're getting, right? If everyone says, hey, this looks good, it could be out sooner. But if there's continues to be a lot of debate and conflicting perspectives that we need to go out and continue to stakehold, that could be later in the spring. So again, that will be determined based on the input that we're getting at the public meetings and the content of the feedback that we get on the plan as to how soon that gets finalized. We want to make sure that everyone has a chance to weigh in. The 10-year plans for the enterprises are required to be finalized by June 1st. So again, all through this spring leading up to June, there will be public input meetings for all of those 10-year plans. The program implementation will start more like the fall. The enterprises will start collecting revenue in July. By the time that finds its way to the agencies through that Department of Revenue process, it'll probably be more, we've heard more like September before the revenue is actually flowing to the agencies. And of course, it will be small amounts of money and we'll ramp up. So we imagine by the end of the year, we'll have some program implementation, but that'll depend on how much revenue is flowing and at what point the agencies are receiving it. And then again, still committed to making sure that we're taking action to start the rulemaking for advanced clean trucks by the end of this year. So that is our timeline. And the next slide. So just a couple of meetings to have on your radar. We will be providing a briefing to the Air Quality Control Commission on February 17th. We, again, are planning to release a draft of the clean truck strategy publicly by the end of this month, public meetings in March. And then, of course, I saw that Mike dropped into the chat the links for all of the enterprises that were created under SB 260. All of those groups are going to be holding listening sessions and working group meetings over the course of the next few months for folks to provide input on those individual 10-year plans for the various topics of all those enterprises. And so I think that's our last slide. We did also put into the chat the link for our Clean Truck website. It's on the screen right now. So if folks have input that they'd like to submit, there's an email address that you can do that, and all of that will be considered as we're continuing to work on the draft strategy. And then, of course, that's our main channel for feedback once we do have the draft out, and we'll be collecting input formally on the draft of the Clean Truck strategy as well. So if there are any questions, we can do that. Otherwise, that's the end of the content that we have for folks today. And as always, we appreciate you taking the time out to join us for these meetings, provide important feedback to the state team who's working hard on all the things in the roadmap and all of the enterprise setup and 10-year plans right now. So definitely appreciate your input on this group. Great. Not seeing any other hands. So again, thank you. Have a great week. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks so much, everyone.